November 11, 1940, 9 p.m. In the middle of the Mediterranean, in pitch darkness, 21 pilots were making their final checks on the deck of HMS Illustrious. Engines rumbled, propellers spun, and salty wind whipped against their faces. In just a few hours, these men would either carry out the boldest air raid in history or meet their end in the cold waters of the Mediterranean. If you're watching this video, you probably know about the attack on Pearl Harbor, that terrible morning of December 7, 1941, when the Japanese devastated the American fleet. But let me tell you something. The Japanese didn't come up with that plan on their own. There was an attack that inspired them. And that attack was carried out exactly 1 year earlier by a handful of British pilots, the raid on Taranto. Never heard of it? That's understandable, because history books have always left this story in the shadow of Pearl Harbor. But the truth is that 21 pilots who dove into Taranto Harbor that night changed the rules of naval warfare forever. And what happened to half of those pilots? Well, that's a story that's never been told. Now I'm going to share this story with you in every detail. But before we continue, let me say this. If you're interested in lesser-known war stories like this one, subscribe, like, and turn on notifications, because on this channel, I tell true stories of heroism you won't hear anywhere else. Ready? Then let's begin. 1940 had started like a nightmare for Britain. France had fallen, Nazi Germany had swallowed Western Europe, and now Mussolini's Italy had entered the war. The Mediterranean had become a death trap. The Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, was the world's fourth most powerful fleet. 6 battleships, 7 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 28 destroyers, all safely anchored at Taranto Harbor in the heel of Italy. This fleet alone outnumbered all British forces in the Mediterranean. The island of Malta was on the verge of starvation. British troops in Egypt desperately watched the skies, waiting for supplies, and Italian battleships could set sail at any moment to tear apart British convoys. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commander of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet, sat at his desk and studied the map. He had to destroy the Italian fleet. But how? If they met in open waters, the Italians would flee. Mussolini wouldn't even let his ships leave port to avoid risking them. Then a crazy idea came to Cunningham. What if we go to them? And that's exactly when the planning for the boldest air raid in history began. Now I need to introduce you to the aircraft that would carry out this attack. And believe me, when you see this plane, you won't believe your eyes. The Fairey Swordfish. The pilots affectionately called it the string bag. Why? Because just like an old shopping bag, it could carry whatever you put in it. But the appearance of this aircraft, in 1940, an era when jet engines were being discussed, the Swordfish was still a biplane. It looked like something from WWII. Wooden frame, fabric covering, open cockpit. Maximum speed? 140 miles per hour, meaning it was slower than some cars. When an American naval officer first saw a Swordfish, he asked his British counterpart, "Where did this plane come from?" The Brit replied, "From Fairey." The American laughed. "Yeah, I can tell. It looks like it flew out of a fairy tale." But here's what everyone missed. Yes, the Swordfish was slow, but that slowness was its greatest advantage. Enemy warships' anti-aircraft guns were calibrated to hit fast aircraft. The Swordfish flew so slowly that the gun sights couldn't track it. Plus, this aircraft had incredible maneuverability. It could fly at wave-top level, just 3 feet above the water. It could make sharp turns, and most importantly, it could carry a 1,200-pound torpedo under its belly. The pilots of HMS Illustrious had been training for night flights for months. Takeoff in darkness, navigation in darkness, torpedo drops in darkness, and the hardest part, landing on a rocking aircraft carrier in the middle of the ocean in complete darkness. During these training sessions, the pilots had developed a technique. They would deliberately stall the Swordfish, cutting engine power to leave the aircraft hanging in the air. Then they'd suddenly slip sideways to evade enemy fire. This maneuver would catch pursuing fighter planes off guard. But there wouldn't be fighter planes at Taranto. What awaited them was far more dangerous. The Italians weren't fools. They knew Taranto harbor could be attacked, and they had prepared their defenses accordingly. 101 anti-aircraft guns, 193 machine guns, 22 powerful searchlights, 13 sound detection stations, 87 barrage balloons, giant balloons suspended in the air to snare aircraft with steel cables, and thousands of meters of steel netting stretched underwater to stop torpedoes. But fate was on the British side. A violent storm on November 6th had torn away 60 of the barrage balloons, and the torpedo nets hadn't been fully deployed because part of them had been removed for a firing exercise. British reconnaissance aircraft had been photographing Taranto for days. Martin, Maryland planes taking off from Malta, flying at altitudes Italian fighters couldn't reach, had captured every inch of the harbor. When these photos were spread across the table of intelligence officers aboard Illustrious, they couldn't believe their eyes. All 6 battleships were in port, including the newest and most powerful ones, Littorio and Vittorio Veneto. Admiral Cunningham turned to Rear Admiral Lumley Lyster. Lyster was the architect of this attack. He had been planning an air raid on Taranto for years. Cunningham said just one word: go. The operation was given a name: Judgement. Judgment Day. But there was a secret aboard Illustrious. A man was walking around the ship, unnoticed by anyone, in civilian clothes, notebook in hand, observing everything. Lieutenant Commander John N. Opie III, United States Navy. America hadn't entered the war yet. It was theoretically neutral, but American intelligence knew there was much to learn from the British. Opie had been secretly sent from Washington. His mission: observe British naval tactics and report back. Opie watched everything from Illustrious's observation gallery: how the aircraft were armed, how the torpedoes were prepared, the special technique developed for torpedo drops in shallow water. He noted everything meticulously. Here lies one of history's greatest ironies. After the Taranto raid, Opie would send a detailed report to Washington. He would warn that Pearl Harbor could be attacked the same way. He even said he wanted to go to Hawaii and tell the boys there what he had learned. But no one would listen to him. His report would be lost in bureaucratic limbo. And exactly 1 year later, American battleships would face the same fate at Pearl Harbor. If you're finding this story interesting, please like and subscribe. Thank you. But we're not there yet. Right now, on the night of November 11th, 1940, Opie waits curiously on the deck of Illustrious, and the pilots are about to board their aircraft. 8 p.m. The sun had long since set. The moon cast a faint light through the clouds. HMS Illustrious had taken position 40 miles west of the Greek island of Kefalonia. Distance to Taranto, 170 miles, about a 2.5-hour flight for the Swordfish. When the pilots emerged from the briefing room, their faces were pale. They knew their targets, and they knew how slim their chances of returning were. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth "Hooch" Williamson was the leader of the first wave, from 815 Squadron, an experienced pilot. With him was his observer, Lieutenant Norman "Blood" Scarlett. Both knew they would make history that night. One pilot turned to his friend and said, "If I don't make it back tonight, tell my mother that—" He couldn't finish his sentence. The engines had started. 8:40 p.m. The first wave, 12 Swordfish, took off one by one. They plunged into the darkness, radio silence, navigation lights off, only the compass and the stars to guide them. The second wave would launch 90 minutes later, but no one knew yet that things wouldn't go as planned for the second wave. Two aircraft would collide on the deck. One would have its fuel tank ripped off and be forced to turn back. The other, though damaged, its pilot would desperately call for mechanics and manage to get clearance for takeoff at the last moment. That pilot's name was Lieutenant E.W. Clifford, and his story would become one of the least known but most dramatic parts of this raid. 12 swordfish flew through the darkness in V formation. The pilots and observers sitting in open cockpits battled the freezing wind. Their flight suits had iced over, their breath formed clouds of steam. Under normal conditions, a swordfish flew with a 3-man crew, pilot, observer, and rear gunner. But the Taranto mission required an extra fuel tank, and that tank was placed in the observer's seat. The observer moved to the gunner's small seat. The gunner was left behind. This meant the pilots were defenseless. There was no one to watch their backs, and the entire burden of navigation fell on the observer's shoulders. The observers found their way in pitch darkness by reading compasses, calculating airspeed, and looking at the stars. One mistake could leave them lost in the middle of the ocean. They had enough fuel, but only enough to reach the target and return, not enough to get lost. And then they encountered clouds, a thick milk-white wall of mist. When the first wave plunged into this fog, the formation broke apart. Williamson continued leading, but the 4 aircraft behind him lost sight of him. They separated. Now they were approaching Taranto in 2 groups. This would actually work in their favor. An attack from 2 different directions would confuse the Italian defenses. 10:50 p.m., the first swordfish spotted Taranto harbor, and at that moment the pilot's blood ran cold. The harbor was lit up like a Christmas tree, but these lights weren't for celebration. They were muzzle flashes from anti-aircraft guns. They were tracer rounds drawing lines of light across the sky. The Italians were waiting. How did they know? One swordfish pilot, Lieutenant Ian Swain, had separated from the group in the clouds. Thinking he was falling behind, he sped up, but he was actually ahead, and Italian sound detection stations had heard his engine. The alarm had been raised. But it was too late to turn back now. Williamson gave his final order over the radio, dive on target, and 11 swordfish dove into hell. This is just the beginning of the story. In Part 2, you'll see all the details of the attack, how the pilots came face to face with death, how torpedoes tore apart mighty battleships, and most importantly, how 2 aircraft were shot down and what happened to their crews. Don't leave me here. Go to Part 2. Don't forget to subscribe and like for these heroes. Welcome back to Part 2. We're going full throttle. 10:58 p.m., November 11, 1940. The sky above Taranto harbor had burst into flames. Hundreds of anti-aircraft shells tore through the air, red, orange, white traces, as if someone had arranged a deadly fireworks display across the sky. And right in the middle of this light show, 11 swordfish aircraft were diving toward their targets. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson was the leader of the first wave. When he looked down from his cockpit, the sight momentarily hypnotized him. Mar Grande, the outer harbor, was filled with massive Italian battleships. Littorio, Vittorio Veneto, Conte di Cavour, Caio Duilio. They were all there, steel giants sleeping in the dark waters. But now they had awakened, and they were furious. Williamson shouted into his headset, "Flare team, engage!" The 2 swordfish in front released their parachute flares. 16 flares drifted down over the eastern side of the harbor, and suddenly everything was lit up like daylight. The Italian battleships appeared like giant shadows gleaming in the spotlight. Their silhouettes were sharp, perfect as targets. Williamson turned to his observer, Scarlett. Do you see the target? Scarlett was glued to his targeting scope. Conte di Cavour, 11 o'clock, ready. Williamson put the Swordfish into a dive. Executing a torpedo attack was one of the most dangerous military maneuvers in the world, and doing it in shallow waters, that was considered impossible. A normal aerial torpedo would plunge 75 feet deep after hitting the water, then it would rise and head toward its target. But Taranto harbor was only 40 feet deep. A normal torpedo would just bury itself in the seabed and stay there. The British had solved this problem. They had attached a special wire device to the nose of the torpedoes. This wire kept the torpedo horizontal when it hit the water. So instead of entering vertically, the torpedo entered horizontally and only dove to about 36 feet, shallow enough. But for this technique to work, pilots had to fly at a very precise angle and extremely low altitude. How low? 50 feet above the water's surface, about the height of a 4-story building. And while doing this, they had to dodge hundreds of anti-aircraft shells. Williamson flew the Swordfish over San Pietro Island, altitude 4,300 feet. Then he went into a dive. Speed was increasing. The howl of the wind filled his ears. The anti-aircraft batteries below were raining fire on him. 1,600 feet, 1,000 feet, 330 feet. The water was approaching. He could see the foam of the waves. Tracer rounds passed on his left and right. A shell punched through his wingtip. The aircraft shook, but Williamson didn't lose control. 160 feet, 100 feet, 65 feet. Conte di Cavour was in his sights. The massive battleship lay in the dark waters like a monster. 27,000 tons of steel, 450 crew members. Williamson pressed the torpedo release button. The 1,200-pound torpedo separated from the Swordfish's belly. The aircraft suddenly lurched upward, lighter now. Williamson pushed the throttle forward and began his escape maneuver, a sharp turn to the left. But at that exact moment, Conte di Cavour's anti-aircraft guns locked on to Williamson. A shell struck the Swordfish's engine compartment. An explosion, smoke, and then the engine died. Williamson tried to pull the controls, but the aircraft no longer responded. The Swordfish was gliding toward the sea, spinning on its wing. Scarlett was shouting from behind, "We can't jump, we're too low." He was right. Parachutes wouldn't open at this altitude. Williamson made one last effort to raise the aircraft's nose. If he could at least make a level landing, maybe they could survive. The Swordfish slammed into the waters of Mar Grande. A massive column of water shot up. The aircraft stayed on the surface for a moment, then flipped upside down and began to sink. Williamson and Scarlett were trying to get out of the cockpit. Ice-cold water was pouring in from everywhere. Darkness, chaos, panic. But both were experienced naval officers. They stayed calm. They unbuckled their safety belts. They swam toward the surface. A few minutes later, both were gasping for air, struggling on the surface. Shells were still splashing into the water around them, but at least they were alive. In the distance, a column of water rose beside Conte di Cavour. Williamson's torpedo had found its target. An 8-meter hole had been torn in the armored hull. The battleship was beginning to sink. But Williamson couldn't see this, because an Italian patrol boat was approaching them. Within an hour, both would become Italian prisoners of war. The leader of the first wave had gone down, but the attack was just beginning. Williamson's crash didn't stop the other pilots. On the contrary, it made them even more determined. Lieutenant Michael Mond was diving toward Littorio. This was the harbor's newest and most powerful battleship. 43,000 tons, 9 15-inch guns, the pride of the Italian Navy. Mond weaved through the anti-aircraft fire. He dodged the cables of barrage balloons, and he released his torpedo at a perfect angle. The torpedo struck Littorio's starboard side. A tremendous explosion. The water column rose higher than the ship's mast. But one torpedo wasn't enough. A few minutes later, another swordfish attacked Littorio. The second torpedo also found its target. The ship was taking on water. Meanwhile, the bombers were doing their job too. Bombs were falling on the oil depots in the harbor. A seaplane hangar had caught fire. Orange flames turned night into day. The attack lasted exactly 65 minutes. During that time, Conte de Cavour took one torpedo hit. She was sinking. 27 crew members lost their lives. Littorio took 3 torpedo hits. Her bow was submerged, listing uncontrollably. Caio Duilio took 1 torpedo hit. 2 of her magazines had flooded. The cruiser Taranto was damaged. Several destroyers were hit. Oil depots and seaplane hangars were burning. And all of this was done by just 11 aircraft. As the first wave withdrew, Italian commanders were trying to understand what had hit them. But the night wasn't over yet. The second wave was on its way. If you're enjoying this story, please like and subscribe. Thank you. 9:28 p.m. The deck of HMS Illustrious. The second wave's 9 swordfish were preparing for takeoff, but things weren't going smoothly. Aircraft 8 and 9 had collided on the deck. Wings were damaged. The pilot of number 9, Lieutenant E.W. Clifford, cursed as he looked at his aircraft. He had been preparing for this mission for months, and now a stupid accident was going to end everything. But Clifford didn't give up. He pleaded with the technicians, "Fix this thing. You can do it." The technicians looked at each other. The wing was damaged, but not unflyable. Risky, but not impossible. Meanwhile, there was an American officer on the ship, Lieutenant Commander John Opie. When he saw Clifford's desperation, he approached and spoke with the flight commander. "This man wants to go. Let him go." Finally, permission was granted. Clifford took off 20 minutes late. Alone, he plunged into the darkness. Meanwhile, the pilot of Aircraft 8, Lieutenant W.D. Morford, was less fortunate. A few minutes after takeoff, his extra fuel tank broke loose. Reaching Taranto was impossible. He had to turn back. But turning back wasn't easy either. When Morford approached Illustrious, the ship's gunners mistook him for an enemy aircraft. They opened fire. For 15 minutes, Morford circled the ship, dodging shells. Finally, he managed to make radio contact and landed safely. So, the second wave was down to 8 aircraft, and Clifford was still on his way, 15 minutes behind them. Midnight, 12 a.m. When the second wave arrived over Taranto, the Italians were fully awake. The first wave had created a surprise effect, but now that advantage was gone. Every gun was firing. The sky was full of lead. And the barrage balloons, thousands of meters of steel cable hanging invisibly in the dark sky. Pilots constantly maneuvered to avoid hitting these cables. Lieutenant Gerald Ginger Hale was the leader of the second wave. He was nicknamed Ginger for his red hair. As for courage, no one ever questioned his. Hale gave his final order to his squadron mates. Focus on your targets. Don't look at anything around you, only your target. Easy to say, but when anti-aircraft shells were raining down like a storm, it was impossible not to look around. The second wave's 5 torpedo aircraft split toward different targets. 2 targeted Littorio. One's torpedo hit, the other missed. One aircraft attacked Caio Duilio and scored a hit. Another launched a torpedo at Vittorio Veneto, but the torpedo failed to find its target. And then there was Lieutenant G.W. Bailey's aircraft. Lieutenant Gerald Bailey was 24 years old. His observer, Lieutenant Henry Slaughter, was 26. Both were young, talented, and brave. Bailey's target was Littorio. She had already taken 2 torpedo hits but was still afloat. One more torpedo might finish the job. Bailey went into his dive. Anti-aircraft fire was intense, but he didn't stop. He descended, lower still. He approached the water's surface. He took aim. He released his torpedo. Hit. A third hole was torn in Littorio's hull. But Bailey couldn't execute his escape maneuver. The heavy cruiser Gorizzia's anti-aircraft guns had caught him. Shells tore the Swordfish apart. The aircraft fell into the sea in flames. Neither Bailey nor Slaughter survived. Both lost their lives that night in the cold waters of Mar Grande. In the first wave, Williamson and Scarlett had been captured but were alive. In the second wave, Bailey and Slaughter were killed in action. These were the only 2 casualties of the Taranto raid, but these 2 losses left a wound that would never heal in the hearts of 21 families. 12:30 a.m. The last aircraft of the second wave had long since left the harbor, but another engine sound was approaching through the darkness. Lieutenant E.W. Clifford. He had taken off 20 minutes late. His wing was damaged. He was alone, and now he was approaching a harbor where the entire Italian defense was on full alert. Clifford's comrades had completed their mission and were returning. He, on the other hand, was heading straight into hell. When he arrived over Taranto, the sight was terrifying. Burning ships, oil spreading across the water's surface, anti-aircraft guns still firing, and smoke everywhere. Clifford turned toward Mar Piccolo, the inner harbor. Italian cruisers were anchored there. He went into a dive. Anti-aircraft fire turned toward him, but he didn't stop. He released his bomb. The target was a cruiser. The bomb punched through the ship's deck, but it didn't explode. It was a defective bomb. Clifford cursed as he executed his escape maneuver, but at least he was safe. He disappeared into the darkness with his damaged wing, and after a long, lonely flight, he returned to HMS Illustrious. At 2:50 a.m., the last Swordfish landed on the deck. It was Clifford. Everyone on the ship greeted him with applause. The Taranto raid was over. When the sun rose, RAF reconnaissance aircraft flew over Taranto. When the photographs they took reached London, Admiral Cunningham couldn't believe his eyes. 3 battleships had been sunk or heavily damaged. Conte di Cavour, completely sunk. Only her mast and main guns remained above water. She was later raised, but repairs were never completed. She never saw service again during the war. Littorio took 3 torpedo hits. Her bow was submerged. Repairs took 5 months. Caio Duilio took 1 torpedo hit. 2 of her magazines had flooded. Repairs took 7 months. Additionally, the cruiser Taranto and several destroyers were damaged. Oil depots and seaplane hangars had burned. In a single night, the Italian Navy had lost half its strength. And what had done this? 36 pilots and observers, 20 old biplanes, a few torpedoes and bombs. Winston Churchill, speaking in the House of Commons, said, "The loss of half of Italy's battleships has decisively altered the balance of power in the Mediterranean." Admiral Cunningham made his own words for history. Taranto and the night of November 11, 1940 should be remembered forever, for it is proved once and for all that the Fleet Air Arm is the Navy's most devastating weapon. The Italian Navy was demoralized. The next day, undamaged ships were evacuated to Naples. They no longer wanted to conduct offensive operations in the Mediterranean. Their fear was obvious. What if the British came again? But Taranto's greatest impact would be felt thousands of miles away, in Tokyo. A few days after the raid, an unfamiliar face appeared at Taranto harbor. A short, slender man. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Naito of the Japanese Navy. He was the assistant naval attaché in the Japanese embassy in Berlin. As soon as he heard the news about Taranto, he had flown to Italy. For days he walked around the harbor. He examined the damaged ships. He spoke with Italian officers. He asked questions about depths, about torpedoes, about defensive weaknesses. He noted everything. Then he returned to Tokyo. In October 1941, Naito met with one of the Japanese Navy's most talented pilots, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida. The meeting lasted late into the night. Naito shared everything he had learned at Taranto with Fuchida. Fuchida focused particularly on one topic: the use of torpedoes in shallow waters. Pearl Harbor's average depth was 40 feet, just like Taranto. The Japanese studied the British torpedo modification. They developed a similar system. They attached wooden fins to their torpedoes, and they intensified their training. On December 7, 1941, Fuchida led 355 aircraft in an attack on Pearl Harbor. Same techniques, same tactics, same result. 8 American battleships were sunk or heavily damaged. 2,300 Americans lost their lives. Taranto had been the dress rehearsal for Pearl Harbor. So couldn't America have prevented this disaster? Lieutenant Commander John Opie had gone to the American embassy in Cairo immediately after the Taranto attack. He wrote a detailed 4-page report. His report included, first, torpedo aircraft launched from aircraft carriers could destroy battleships in harbor. Second, the use of torpedoes in shallow waters was now possible. Third, night raids were far more effective than daytime attacks. Fourth, some experts argued that ships should put to sea on moonlit nights rather than remain in harbor. Opie sent his report to Washington. He also wrote a letter to his superiors. "I need to go to Hawaii and talk to the boys there," he said. "I need to share what I've learned with them." No one responded. Opie's report was lost in the labyrinth of bureaucracy. For weeks it was passed from desk to desk. Finally, it was summarized by naval intelligence and sent to the commanders at Pearl Harbor. But the summary didn't include the critical details, and no one took it seriously anyway. Pearl Harbor's waters were too shallow for torpedoes, right? Japanese torpedoes would just bury themselves in the bottom, right? Wrong. The Imperial Japanese Navy did what the American Navy didn't. They learned from Taranto. So what happened to Williamson and Scarlett? Both were taken to Italian prisoner of war camps. They spent years in captivity, but they survived. Williamson returned to England after the war. He was decorated for his heroism, but he always remembered his fallen comrades, Bailey and Slaughter. Scarlett returned too. This brave observer, known by his nickname Blood, continued with his life after the war. Neither ever forgot that night, those moments in pitch darkness, in freezing water, coming face to face with death. But they were the lucky ones. Bailey and Slaughter's families never saw their loved ones again. 2 young officers sleep quietly in the dusty pages of history. In their memory, every year on November 11th, the heroes of Taranto are commemorated in Britain. Taranto was a turning point in history. For centuries, naval battles had been won through artillery duels between mighty battleships, dreadnoughts, ironclads, cruisers. Whoever had the bigger guns, whoever had the thicker armor, they won. Taranto shattered that understanding in a single night. Now a handful of old aircraft could sink massive battleships. The threat from the air was more important than the threat from the sea. Aircraft carriers were replacing battleships. This lesson was learned immediately by some. The Japanese studied Taranto and planned Pearl Harbor. The Americans only understood after Pearl Harbor. But the British knew. The pilots who flew over Taranto that night knew. They had written the future of naval warfare, and they had paid for it with their blood. The final chapter of this story awaits you in Part 3. You'll see the pilots return home, how their heroism was recorded in history, and what this event means for today. But the most shocking information will come in the final part. What happened to the British pilots after Taranto and the unexpected consequences of this raid. Don't forget to go to Part 3, subscribe, and like for this story of heroism.
We've arrived at the final part. We're going full throttle without stopping. November 12, 1940. Dawn. As the sun rose over the Mediterranean, the deck of HMS Illustrious began to stir. Lookouts scanned the horizon, gunners stood ready, and everyone was asking the same question: how many aircraft will return? No one had slept through the night. Every soldier, every officer, every technician on the ship was waiting for the pilots to return. Some prayed silently, some went up on deck and stared into the darkness. Some were crushed under the unbearable weight of waiting. At 1:20 a.m., the first Swordfish appeared. A propeller sound from the distance, then a silhouette emerging from the darkness. The aircraft made a low pass over the ship, entered its landing pattern, and glided toward the deck. When the wheels touched down, applause erupted. The first pilot had returned. Over the next hour and a half, aircraft came in one by one. Each landing was greeted with a cry of joy. Technicians rushed to meet the planes. Pilots staggered with exhaustion as they climbed out of their cockpits. Some had flight suits riddled with bullet holes. Some had dried blood on their faces, but they were all alive. The last to land was Lieutenant E.W. Clifford, 2:50 a.m. After his long solo flight with a damaged wing, he had miraculously returned safe and sound. Everyone on deck greeted him with applause. Clifford smiled as he climbed down from the aircraft. He was exhausted, but proud. 21 aircraft had taken off. 19 had returned. 2 aircraft were missing. 4 men were missing. Williamson and Scarlett had been captured. They were alive, but could no longer fight. Bailey and Slaughter had remained forever in the cold, dark waters of the Mediterranean. Before resting, the pilots gathered in the briefing room. Despite their exhaustion, each one had to give a report. What had they seen? Where had they attacked? How many hits had they scored? Admiral Cunningham's staff listened carefully to the pilots. They noted every word. They questioned every detail. What the pilots described was incredible. Conte de Cavour had taken 1 torpedo hit. The ship was sinking. Littorio had taken 3 torpedo hits. The ship was heavily damaged. Caio Duilio had taken 1 torpedo hit. The ship was taking on water. Oil depots were burning. Seaplane hangars had been destroyed. Numerous smaller vessels had been damaged. Senior officers were skeptical at first. How could such success be possible with so few losses? Maybe the pilots were exaggerating. Could they have misjudged their targets in the darkness of night? But then the reconnaissance photographs from Malta arrived. RAF aircraft had flown over Taranto as soon as dawn broke. The photographs they took were sent to headquarters in Alexandria. And when these photos were spread across the table, everyone in the room held their breath. What the pilots described was true. In fact, the reality was even better than they had reported. Conte de Cavour had almost completely sunk. Only her superstructure and main guns were visible above water. 27 crew members had lost their lives. There were over 100 wounded. The ship would later be raised, but repairs would never be completed. She would never sail again during the war.
Littorio lay with her bow submerged. 3 torpedoes had torn massive holes in her hull. Repairs would take 5 months. Caio Duilio had been beached. 2 of her magazines had flooded. Repairs would take 7 months. The cruiser Taranto had been damaged. The destroyers Libeccio and Passanio had sustained damage. Oil tanks had burned. Seaplane hangars had been destroyed. Admiral Cunningham studied the photographs for a long time. Then he smiled and turned to those beside him. My God, the boys actually did it. In a single night, 20 old biplanes had put half the Italian Navy out of action. The intoxication of success made some commanders ambitious. Let's attack again tomorrow night, they said. The Italians are in shock. Their defenses are in disarray. We can sink the remaining ships. In theory, it made sense, but in practice, it was impossible. The pilots were exhausted. After hours of tense flying, they were physically and mentally drained. Some could barely stand. Some mixed up their sentences when speaking. The adrenaline had worn off, and fatigue had set in. And one of them stood up during the briefing. He said a sentence that would go down in history. Even the Light Brigade was only asked to charge once. This was a reference to the Battle of Balaclava in the 1854 Crimean War. In that battle, 600 British cavalrymen had been sent on an impossible mission. They had charged into the midst of Russian artillery, and nearly all of them had died. The pilot was saying, politely but firmly, "You sent us to our deaths once, and we came back. Don't push our luck again." Besides, the weather was deteriorating. Thick clouds had covered Taranto. Reconnaissance aircraft couldn't see the harbor. Conditions weren't suitable for a night attack. After a long silence, Admiral Cunningham made his decision. The second attack was canceled. The fleet would set course for Alexandria. The pilots breathed a sigh of relief. That night they were able to sleep in warm beds, but sleep wasn't peaceful. Some talked in their sleep. In their dreams they saw anti-aircraft fire, the cables of barrage balloons, aircraft bursting into flames, friends falling into dark waters. The psychological wounds of war heal far deeper and far longer than physical ones. News of Taranto spread around the world within hours. If you're enjoying this story too, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. In London, Winston Churchill gave a victory speech in the House of Commons. His voice trembled with pride. The loss of half of Italy's battleships has decisively and permanently altered the balance of power in the Mediterranean. This is a magnificent achievement of the Royal Navy and the Fleet Air Arm. People celebrated in the streets of London. For the first time since the war began, real news of victory had arrived. The pain of Dunkirk, the shock of France's fall, the terror of the Blitz. On top of all this, the victory at Taranto came like a healing balm. In Washington, the New York Times ran the story on the front page. A 6-column headline, "British hit Italian fleet from the air." The Washington Post similarly announced it as their lead story. But at American Navy headquarters in Washington, the news was received differently. Some admirals dismissed it. The Italians fight poorly anyway, they said. This is just proof of Italian incompetence. Nothing like this could happen to us. Others were concerned. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, wrote a letter to Admiral James Richardson, commander of the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, a few days after the news. His letter contained this warning: Taranto has shown that a successful torpedo attack can be made against ships in harbor. I recommend you review Pearl Harbor's security again. Richardson received the letter. He read it, and he filed it away. Those who watched the Taranto news most carefully were 10,000 kilometers away, in Tokyo. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been looking for ways to establish dominance in the Pacific for years. America's Pacific Fleet was the biggest obstacle to these plans, and that fleet was anchored at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was Japan's most brilliant naval strategist. He had already been thinking about planning an attack on Pearl Harbor, but there was a problem. Pearl Harbor's waters were too shallow, 40 feet deep. Normal torpedoes would bury themselves in the bottom. When the Taranto news arrived, Yamamoto's eyes lit up. The British had succeeded in using torpedoes in a harbor 40 feet deep. This meant it could be done at Pearl Harbor too. Yamamoto sent a message to Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Naito, the Assistant Naval Attaché in Berlin. Go to Taranto, learn everything. Naito reached Taranto a few weeks after the raid. For days he walked around the harbor. He examined the damaged ships. He spoke with Italian officers. Depths, distances, angles, torpedo techniques. He noted everything. He focused particularly on one question: how had the British made torpedoes work in shallow water? He found the answer. The special device attached to the torpedo's nose changed the angle of entry into the water. The torpedo entered horizontally instead of vertically and headed towards its target without diving too deep. Naito reported what he had learned to Tokyo. In October 1941, he met with Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had been selected to lead the Pearl Harbor attack. The meeting lasted late into the night. Naito described what he had seen at Taranto down to the finest detail. Fuchida asked questions, asked again, and asked again. He committed every detail to memory. After the war, Naito would say, "The most difficult problem at Pearl Harbor was using torpedoes in shallow water. The British Navy attacked the Italian fleet at Taranto, and I learned a great deal from that lesson." On December 7, 1941, 355 aircraft under Fuchida's command attacked Pearl Harbor. Wooden fins had been attached to the torpedoes, just as the British had done. 8 American battleships were sunk or heavily damaged. 2,300 Americans lost their lives. Taranto had been both the inspiration and the dress rehearsal for Pearl Harbor. And here lies history's most bitter irony. Lieutenant Commander John Opie of the United States Navy had personally witnessed the Taranto attack from HMS Illustrious. He had seen everything. He had understood everything. Immediately after the raid, he went to the American Embassy in Cairo. He wrote a detailed 4-page report. His report included, first, torpedo aircraft launched from aircraft carriers could destroy battleships in harbor. Second, the use of torpedoes in shallow waters was now technically possible. Third, night raids were highly effective for surprising defenses. Fourth, ships should put to sea on moonlit nights rather than remain in harbor. Opie sent his report to Washington via diplomatic pouch. Then he wrote a personal letter to his superiors. "I need to go to Hawaii," he said. "I need to tell the boys at Pearl Harbor what I've learned. This information is vitally important." No response came. In January 1941, Opie also witnessed HMS Illustrious come under Stuka attack. He wrote another report about this too. He described how vulnerable aircraft carriers could be. In March 1941, he returned to London. In April, he boarded a ship to America. When he arrived in Washington, he went straight to Navy headquarters. On April 29, 1941, Opie met with members of the General Board and representatives of relevant bureaus. He described Taranto. He emphasized that Pearl Harbor was vulnerable to a similar attack. "Let me go to Hawaii," he said. "I need to talk face to face with the guys there." The answer was no. "There's no need," they said. "Pearl Harbor is safe. The Japanese wouldn't go that far." Opie's report was lost in the labyrinth of bureaucracy. It passed from desk to desk. It was summarized, simplified, diluted. By the time it reached the commanders at Pearl Harbor, most of the critical details were missing. And no one took it seriously anyway. Pearl Harbor's waters were too shallow for torpedoes, right? The Japanese couldn't be that crazy, right? Wrong, and wrong. On the morning of Pearl Harbor, Opie was probably listening to the news on the radio. Japanese aircraft had attacked Pearl Harbor. Arizona had sunk. Oklahoma had sunk. California, West Virginia, Nevada, all had been damaged. 2,300 Americans had lost their lives. Everything Opie had warned about a year earlier had come true. Torpedoes had been used in shallow water. Ships in harbor had been left defenseless. The attack came at dawn instead of night, but the result was the same. And no one had listened to him. Think about this irony of history. An American officer had foreseen exactly how Pearl Harbor would be struck a full year in advance. He had warned, he had pleaded, but bureaucracy, arrogance, and indifference had drowned out his voice. Opie remained in the Navy after the war. He rose to the rank of captain, but he continued telling the story of Taranto, perhaps hoping that someone in the future would listen, perhaps hoping that history wouldn't repeat itself. Most of the Taranto pilots survived the war, but the war had changed them. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson spent 3 years in Italian prisoner of war camps. Conditions were harsh, food was scarce, disease was widespread. But Williamson survived. After the war, he returned to England and continued his service in the Royal Navy. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order. After retirement, he lived a quiet life. When he passed away in the 1970s, he left behind a proud legacy. His observer, Norman Blood Scarlett, also returned from captivity. He transitioned to civilian life after the war. He gave interviews about Taranto. He never forgot that night, that dive, that crash, that ice-cold water. Ginger Gerald Hale, the leader of the second wave, survived the war. He had a long and honorable career.